Close your eyes for a moment. Listen to the silence around you. In that quiet space, imagine the sound of distant rain falling on broad leaves, the whisper of wind through bamboo, and the gentle lapping of water against wooden boats in a far-off delta. This is Vietnam, a land where ancient rivers have flowed for millennia, where the scent of incense mingles with monsoon air, and where the weight of history rests heavy on misty mountains. Tonight, we journey into the shadows of a war that changed everything. Not just the clatter of helicopters or the thunder of artillery, but the quiet moments between, the letters written by candlelight, the prayers whispered in foxholes, the dreams that carried soldiers and civilians alike through the longest nights of their lives. But before we begin this journey through time, before we walk together into the jungles of memory, subscribe to the Dreaming of Past channel. Leave a comment and tell us what other stories from history's quiet corners you'd love to hear whispered in the darkness. Now, dim the lights. Let the world outside fade away. Close your eyes and simply listen. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders drop, and drift with me into a story that begins not with gunfire, but with the gentle sound of rain on a tin roof in a village whose name the world would soon learn to remember. The morning mist clung to the Mekong Delta like a memory that refused to fade. In the year 1963, Vietnam breathed with the rhythm of ancient seasons, rice paddies stretching endlessly toward horizons where water met sky, where farmers had worked the same fields their ancestors had tended for 1,000 years. The air carried the sweetness of jasmine and the earthiness of wet soil. But underneath there was something else. Something that made the old women pause as they hung laundry in the early light, their weathered hands stilling on the line. The French had left, their colonial dream dissolved like sugar in monsoon rain. But the Americans were arriving, not as conquerors in the old way, but as advisors, as helpers, as friends bearing gifts of medicine and machinery. In the presidential palace in Saigon, Ngo Dinh Diem sat behind mahogany desks, making decisions that would ripple through generations. His fingers traced maps of a country divided, a nation cut in half by invisible lines that burned as surely as any blade. To the north, in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh walked through streets where French cafes still served coffee with the bitter sweetness of chicory. His beard was white now, his body frail, but his eyes held the patient fire of someone who had waited decades for this moment. He had seen the French leave, had watched empires crumble like leaves in autumn wind, and now he dreamed of a Vietnam unified under one flag, one voice, one destiny. The villages between these two visions knew nothing of grand strategy or domino theories. They knew only the weight of rice sheaves at harvest time, the taste of river fish caught in nets their fathers had woven, the sound of children's laughter echoing across courtyards where incense burned before ancestral altars. In these places, time moved like honey, thick and golden and undisturbed by the urgent whispers of men in distant capitals. But change was coming. It rode on the wind like the scent of distant fires, carried in the drone of helicopters that appeared on the horizon like mechanical dragonflies. American soldiers, young men from Kansas wheat fields and Brooklyn stoops, from California beaches and Texas ranches, began arriving in numbers that grew like raindrops becoming a storm. They came with good intentions, with faith in their mission, with photographs of sweethearts tucked into helmet bands and letters from mothers in their breast pockets. The first advisors tried to understand this land that was green beyond anything they had ever imagined. They sweated through uniforms in humidity that seemed to press down from the sky itself, learned to recognize the difference between the crack of bamboo and the snap of a twig under a hostile foot. They ate rice with chopsticks and smiled at children who watched them with eyes that held both curiosity and something older, a wariness passed down through generations who had seen too many foreigners come and go. In the Buddhist temples, monks in saffron robes continued their meditations, their chanting a constant beneath the increasingly urgent hum of military activity. They had seen kingdoms rise and fall, had watched the wheel of karma turn through cycles of violence and peace. Now they lit incense for the souls of the living as much as the dead, sensing that the ancient balance was about to shift in ways that would take generations to understand. The Viet Cong moved through this landscape like ghosts, farmers by day who knew every hidden path, every secret cache, every sympathetic village. They were not yet the enemy in the minds of the American advisors. They were obstacles to be overcome, problems to be solved with the right combination of technology and goodwill. But in the villages, people began to whisper of neighbors who disappeared into the jungle at night, of hidden tunnels and secret meetings, of a war that was being fought not with armies, but with shadows. As 1963 drew to a close, the monsoon rains seemed heavier than usual, as if the sky itself were weeping for what was to come. In Washington, President Kennedy studied reports from a country most Americans could barely find on a map. The advisors were confident, the intelligence was promising, and the commitment was limited. Just a few thousand men, just a temporary intervention, just enough to tip the balance and allow freedom to flourish. But in the rice paddies and rubber plantations, in the delta villages and mountain hamlets, those who listened to the wind heard something else. They heard the distant rumble of a storm that would not pass quickly, that would test every soul it touched, that would ask questions about courage and sacrifice and the price of freedom that had no easy answers. The scent of jasmine still perfumed the evening air, but now it mixed with something else, the metallic tang of fear, the acrid smell of decisions made in rooms far from those who would pay their price. Vietnam was about to become more than a place on a map. It was about to become a word that would echo through history, a test of wills that would reshape not just Southeast Asia, but the soul of America itself. In the gathering darkness, mothers pulled their children closer, and young men on both sides of the world said prayers in languages that would soon meet in the crucible of war. The autumn of 1963 brought more than the usual monsoon clouds to Vietnam. In the presidential palace in Saigon, President Diem's shadow grew longer and darker as Buddhist monks began their protests, their saffron robes bright against the grey concrete of the city's boulevards. The smell of gasoline and burning flesh would soon join the jasmine and incense that had perfumed the air for centuries. On November the 2nd, as the sun set over the Mekong Delta, the sound of tank treads on cobblestones echoed through Saigon's quiet streets. Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu were found dead in the back of an armored personnel carrier, their bodies bearing the stigmata of a revolution that had devoured its own children. The news reached Washington just as President Kennedy was reviewing plans for a limited withdrawal of American advisors. 3 weeks later in Dallas, another motorcade would change history's course forever. The new president, Lyndon Johnson, inherited a war that existed in the spaces between words. Not quite a war, not quite peace, but something that required decisions no textbook had prepared him for. In the Oval Office, maps of Vietnam spread across mahogany tables, like prayers waiting to be answered. The advisors spoke of dominoes falling, of communist expansion, of the need to draw lines in the fertile soil of Southeast Asia. But late at night, when the briefings ended and the lights dimmed, Johnson would stand at the windows overlooking the Potomac and wonder what price freedom would demand. In Vietnam, the death of Diem had opened a door that could never be closed. The South Vietnamese government became a revolving door of generals and politicians, each promising stability, while the ground beneath their feet shifted like quicksand. The Viet Cong, sensing opportunity in the chaos, began to move with greater boldness. Their black pajamas became a uniform of shadows, their knowledge of the terrain a weapon more powerful than any American technology. The American advisors, now numbering in the thousands, found themselves in a land where the rules of engagement were written in water. A farmer ploughing his rice paddy at dawn might be laying booby traps at midnight. A child selling fruit in the market might be counting the American soldiers for someone else. The very air seemed to whisper secrets that the Americans could not understand, no matter how many interpreters they hired or how many cultural briefings they attended. In the jungle, the ancient trees had witnessed empires rise and fall, had seen Chinese armies and French colonists, Japanese invaders, and now Americans. Their roots ran deep into soil that had been watered with blood before these new foreigners were born. The monkeys in the canopy chattered warnings that the soldiers below could not decipher, and the birds fell silent at the approach of men who carried death in their hearts, even when they thought they carried only freedom. The villages began to change in ways that could not be measured in statistics or reports. Families that had lived in the same place for generations started to glance toward the jungle with new eyes, calculating distances and hiding places. Rice was hidden in secret caches, not for the lean season, but for the lean years that seemed to be coming. Children learned to recognize the sound of different aircraft, the difference between the chop of a medical helicopter and the whine of a fighter jet. Buddhist temples became refugees of a different kind. The monks, who had once meditated on the nature of suffering in abstract terms, now found themselves tending to wounds that were all too real. Their prayers took on new urgency as they sought to understand how the Dharma of non-violence could coexist with the necessity of resistance. Some chose the path of the flame, burning themselves in public squares to bear witness to suffering that had no other voice. The first major battle came at Apbac in January 1963, where South Vietnamese forces, supported by American advisors, met the Viet Cong in open combat. The rice paddies ran red with blood that afternoon, and the sound of helicopters crashing echoed across the delta like the death cries of mechanical dragons. The Americans learned that their enemy was not the ragtag militia they had expected, but a disciplined force that knew every palm tree, every ditch, every hiding place in their homeland. As 1964 dawned, the number of American advisors continued to grow like a tide that knew only one direction. They came with good intentions and modern weapons, with faith in their mission and photographs of home. But the Vietnam they encountered was not the Vietnam of their briefings. It was a land where the past and present existed simultaneously, where ancient spirits watched from jungle shadows as young men from distant continents learned to hate and fear and love with an intensity that would mark them forever. The smell of napalm began to join the natural perfumes of the countryside. Orange smoke drifted across landscapes that had been green since the beginning of time. The sound of artillery became as common as the call of birds, and the night sky occasionally lit up with flares that turned the darkness into a kind of apocalyptic day. In American living rooms, families gathered around television sets to watch grainy footage of a conflict that seemed both very far away and uncomfortably close. The names of Vietnamese villages began to appear in newspapers, strange syllables that rolled off American tongues like prayers in a foreign language. But the full weight of what was beginning had not yet settled into the national consciousness. That would come later, when the body bags started arriving with the regularity of mail delivery, when the evening news became a nightly accounting of loss that no victory could balance. For now, in the gathering darkness of 1964, Vietnam remained a problem to be solved, a challenge to be met with American ingenuity and determination. The men who made the decisions still believed that the right combination of firepower and goodwill could tip the balance, that democracy could be planted in foreign soil like rice in a paddy field. But in the villages and jungles, in the hearts of those who knew the land's secrets, a different truth was taking root, that this war would not be won by any army, but would consume them all in its hungry fire. The summer of 1964 hung over the South China Sea like a fever dream, the water stretching endlessly toward horizons that shimmered with heat and possibility. On August 2nd, as the sun reached its merciless zenith, the USS Maddox cut through waters that had witnessed the passage of Chinese junks and Portuguese galleons, French warships, and Japanese destroyers. Now it carried the hopes and fears of a nation that was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The destroyer's wake spread behind it like a scar on the perfect blue of the Gulf of Tonkin, and in that wake, history was about to turn. The sailors aboard the Maddox were young men from America's heartland, boys who had grown up on stories of their fathers' victories in World War II, who believed that American ships sailed in righteous waters. They could not have known that their engagement with North Vietnamese torpedo boats would become the key that unlocked the door to a war that would consume a generation. In the Pentagon, the fluorescent lights burned through the night as officials studied radar screens and radio transcripts, trying to piece together the truth of what had happened in those dark waters. The reports were contradictory, the evidence ambiguous, but the momentum was undeniable. 3 days later, on August 5th, President Johnson would stand before Congress and ask for the authority to use military force to defend American interests in Southeast Asia. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution would pass with only 2 dissenting votes, and the restraints that had held back the full force of American military power would finally break. But in the villages of Vietnam, the news of congressional authorization meant nothing compared to the reality of what was already happening. The number of American advisors had grown to over 20,000, and they were no longer just advising. They were fighting and dying in numbers that could no longer be explained away as training accidents or isolated incidents. The fiction of limited involvement was crumbling like ancient masonry under the weight of truth. The first Marines landed at Da Nang on March 8, 1965, wading through surf that sparkled in the morning light. They came ashore with full combat gear, their faces painted with camouflage that made them look like jungle spirits. The local population gathered to watch this new arrival, children pointing at the strange, pale giants who spoke in harsh syllables and carried weapons that seemed to be made of pure destruction. Da Nang had been a sleepy coastal city where fishermen mended nets in the afternoon shade and merchants sold silk and spices in markets that had operated for centuries. Now it became a fortress, a beachhead for an invasion that called itself Liberation. The sounds of construction mixed with the ancient rhythms of the sea, bulldozers and pile drivers competing with the call of seabirds and the whisper of waves on sand. The transformation was not just physical but spiritual. The air itself seemed to change, charged with a new kind of electricity that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. The smell of diesel fuel and cordite began to overpower the natural perfumes of frangipani and sea salt. At night, the horizon glowed with the lights of military installations that grew like phosphorescent fungi in the darkness. The Viet Cong watched from the hills and jungles, their black pajamas making them invisible against the shadows of palm trees and bamboo groves. They had learned patience from their ancestors, had absorbed the lesson that invaders always came with great noise and eventually left with great sorrow. But they also knew that this invasion was different, larger, more determined, backed by technology that seemed to come from a future that Vietnam had not yet imagined. Ho Chi Minh, in his modest house in Hanoi, received reports of the American buildup with the calm of a man who had seen many storms. His health was failing, his body worn thin by decades of revolution and war, but his mind remained sharp as a blade. He had read American history, had studied the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and he knew that Americans had their own traditions of fighting for freedom that would make them formidable opponents. But he also knew that Vietnam was not their home, and that homesickness was a weapon more powerful than any bomb. The first major battle involving American ground forces came at Ia Drang in November 1965, where the 1st Cavalry Division met the North Vietnamese Army in a collision that shook the earth itself. The helicopters descended like a swarm of mechanical locusts, their rotors beating the air into submission. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley for days, punctuated by the screams of wounded men and the prayers of those who knew they might not see another sunrise. In the elephant grass and bamboo thickets, soldiers from both sides learned lessons that no training manual could teach. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but action, despite it, that brotherhood was forged in the crucible of shared suffering, that the line between civilization and savagery was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. The Americans learned that their enemy was not only willing to die for their cause, but eager to do so, that every hill and valley in Vietnam was defended by men who knew the ground like their own faces. The North Vietnamese learned that American firepower was indeed devastating, that their enemy possessed technology that could turn night into day and jungle into wasteland. But they also learned that Americans bled as red as anyone else, that their sophisticated equipment was useless when the batteries died, that their soldiers were homesick boys who cried for their mothers when the morphine wore off. Back in the United States, the war was still something that happened on television screens and in newspaper headlines. Walter Cronkite delivered the nightly body count with the measured tone of a man reading stock prices, and the numbers seemed abstract, mathematical, somehow unreal. But in the suburbs and small towns, in the projects and farmhouses, mothers were beginning to wake up in the middle of the night with a cold dread that had no name. The draft notices arrived in mailboxes like autumn leaves, inevitable and unwelcome. Young men who had planned to go to college or marry their high school sweethearts found themselves on buses to basic training, their heads shaved and their illusions stripped away with the same mechanical efficiency. They learned to kill with bayonets and bare hands, to call in airstrikes and operate radio equipment, to suppress their natural human instincts in favor of military discipline. By the end of 1965, there were nearly 200,000 American soldiers in Vietnam, and the number was growing every month. The war that had begun as a limited intervention to support a friendly government had become something else entirely, a full-scale military commitment that would test every assumption about American power and purpose. In the jungles and rice paddies, in the mountains and deltas, young men from Kansas and California, from New York and Texas, learned to navigate a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. They learned to recognize the difference between the sound of wind in bamboo and the whisper of an enemy moving through tall grass. They learned to love and hate their fellow soldiers with an intensity that would mark them for life, to depend on men they might never have spoken to in civilian life. The night sounds of Vietnam became a symphony of survival. The drone of insects, the distant thump of artillery, the metallic click of weapons being cleaned and loaded. In the darkness, soldiers wrote letters home that they would never send, said prayers to gods they had forgotten in peacetime, and tried to make sense of a war that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The darkness was deepening, and there was no light on the horizon. The year 1966 brought rains that seemed to fall upward, bullets and bombs descending from the sky like a monsoon of steel. The Rolling Thunder campaign had begun in earnest, and the ancient rhythms of Vietnam's weather were joined by the new rhythm of war. The daily thunder of B-52 bombers passing overhead like mechanical clouds, their payload of destruction falling into jungles that had known only the gentle violence of typhoons and the patient erosion of rivers. In the villages of North Vietnam, Families learned to recognize the sound of approaching aircraft, the way their grandparents had learned to read the signs of coming storms. The children developed a game, counting the seconds between the whistle of falling bombs and the earth-shaking explosions that followed. The winners were those who could guess most accurately where the next crater would appear in the rice paddies, as if destruction had become just another part of the landscape to be mapped and understood. The American pilots who flew these missions saw Vietnam from 30,000 feet, a green carpet marked by silver ribbons of rivers and the occasional brown scar of a bomb crater. They flew in formation like migrating birds, their contrails writing temporary poetry across the sky. To them, the targets were coordinates on a map, grid squares to be eliminated, strategic objectives in the grand chess game of war. They could not see the faces of the people below, could not hear the prayers being whispered in bomb shelters or the lullabies sung to frighten children. But the war was not just being fought in the air. On the ground, American soldiers were learning the particular hell of fighting an enemy who knew every tree, every trail, every hiding place in their ancestral homeland. The jungle became a cathedral of fear, its canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight, its floor carpeted with rotting leaves that muffled footsteps and concealed deadly surprises. The booby traps were works of art in their deadly simplicity, sharpened bamboo stakes that could pierce a combat boot and the foot inside it, tripwires connected to grenades that had been gifts from the Soviet Union, mines made from unexploded American ordnance that had been carefully harvested and repurposed. The Vietnamese had learned to turn their enemy's strength into weakness, to make every step through their homeland a potential last step. In the base camps, American soldiers created small versions of home in the midst of chaos. They built clubs where Motown music competed with the sound of distant artillery, where beer was cold and the conversation was about anything except the war. They wrote letters on paper that grew soft in the humidity, telling their families that everything was fine, that they were safe, that the war would be over soon. They lied with the casual grace of men who had learned that truth was sometimes too heavy to carry. The medical units worked with the efficiency of factory workers, triaging wounds that ranged from minor cuts to catastrophic injuries that would require explanations to families who had never seen their sons sacrifice. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the smell of jungle rot, creating a perfume that would haunt the survivors long after they returned to a world that had never smelled like Vietnam. The Vietnamese people, caught between the hammer and the anvil of war, adapted with the resilience of rice that bends in the wind but does not break. Entire villages disappeared into tunnel systems that had been dug with the patience of termites, creating an underground nation that existed parallel to the surface world. Children learned to live in darkness, to breathe air that had been filtered through layers of earth, to sleep to the lullaby of bombs falling on empty fields above. The tunnels were more than hiding places. They were workshops where weapons were repaired, hospitals where wounded fighters were nursed back to health, schools where the next generation learned the mathematics of resistance. The air was thick with the smoke of cooking fires that had to be carefully filtered to avoid detection, and the walls were lined with the photographs of ancestors who had fought the Chinese, the French, and now the Americans. In the cities, life continued with the surreal normalcy of people who had learned to live with war as a constant companion. Saigon became a boom town where American dollars mixed with Vietnamese plasters, where bars and brothels flourished like tropical flowers in the artificial sunlight of war prosperity. The streets filled with the sound of motorcycles and jeeps, with the chatter of merchants selling everything from black market weapons to authentic Vietnamese handicrafts made in factories that had been bombed the week before. The American soldiers on leave walked through these streets like sleepwalkers, their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much too quickly. They bought drinks for bar girls whose names they would never remember, ate food that tasted like home but wasn't, and tried to forget the friends they had left behind in the jungle. The city offered amnesia in various forms: alcohol, drugs, sex, or simply the blessed anonymity of crowds where no one knew your name or your story. But even in the cities, the war was always present. The sound of helicopters was as common as the sound of birds, and the night sky was regularly lit by flares that turned the darkness into a kind of artificial day. The smell of diesel fuel and cordite mixed with the traditional odors of cooking oil and incense, creating a perfume that belonged to no other place or time. The casualty reports arrived in Washington with the regularity of weather forecasts, and the numbers grew larger each week. The Pentagon briefing spoke of body counts and kill ratios, of strategic hamlets and free fire zones, of progress measured in statistics that seemed to have no relationship to the reality being lived by the soldiers in the field. The war was becoming a numbers game where success was measured in death, where victory was defined by the arithmetic of destruction. In the villages, the old women who had seen French soldiers and Japanese occupiers now watched American GIs with the same patient eyes that had witnessed every invasion in their long lives. They knew that soldiers were just boys far from home, that they missed their mothers and dreamed of sweethearts, that they were afraid of dying in a land whose language they could not speak. But they also knew that these particular boys carried weapons that could turn their villages into smoking ruins, that their homesickness was irrelevant to the children hiding in the bunkers. The monsoon season brought not just rain, but a kind of mechanical precipitation. Shell casings and shrapnel, pieces of aircraft and fragments of dreams. The earth itself seemed to be weeping, the red clay mixing with blood and oil to create a mud that would stain everything it touched. In this mud, soldiers from both sides learned that courage was not glorious but necessary, that heroism was not dramatic but quiet, that war was not an adventure but a job that had to be done by someone. As 1966 turned into 1967, the war had settled into a routine that felt like it might last forever. The Americans controlled the days, the Vietnamese controlled the nights, and the twilight hours belonged to the dead. The jungle grew back over the bomb craters, with the persistence of nature reclaiming its own, and the cycle of destruction and renewal continued like a broken record that could not be stopped. In the darkness, mothers on both sides of the world said the same prayers in different languages, asking the same gods for the same impossible thing, that their sons would come home whole, that the war would end, that the world would make sense again. But the darkness was deepening, and the light seemed farther away than ever. The Year of the Monkey began with fireworks, as it always had in Vietnam. But in 1968, the explosions that lit up the night sky during Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, were not celebrating the lunar calendar's promise of renewal. They were the sound of a war that had suddenly erupted into every corner of a nation that had been living with violence for so long that peace had become a forgotten dream. On January 30th, as families gathered to honor their ancestors and welcome the new year, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. The offensive had been planned with the patience of farmers planning the rice harvest, every detail rehearsed until the movements became as natural as breathing. The Lunar New Year, when South Vietnamese forces would be celebrating with their families, when American attention would be focused on the traditional ceasefire, became the perfect moment for a strike that would change the war's very nature. In Saigon, the sound of gunfire echoed through streets that had been decorated with paper lanterns and flowering branches. The American embassy, that symbol of foreign power that had stood like a fortress in the heart of the city, came under direct attack. The television cameras captured images that would burn themselves into the American consciousness. Viet Cong sappers blowing holes in the embassy wall, American Marines fighting room by room through their own stronghold, the perfectly manicured lawn littered with bodies and brass shell casings. The fighting was not the distant artillery exchanges that had characterized so much of the war, but close-quarters combat that turned every building into a potential battlefield. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the traditional incense of Tet celebrations, creating a perfume that belonged to no holiday anyone had ever imagined. In the Buddhist temples, monks continued their prayers while bullets shattered the windows and shrapnel scarred the ancient walls. The ancient city of Hue, with its imperial palace and its thousand-year history, became a battleground where the past and present collided with devastating force. The Perfume River, which had carried the poetry of emperors and the whispers of lovers for centuries, now carried the bodies of soldiers from both sides. The citadel that had withstood the Mongols and the French now echoed with the sound of American Marines fighting house by house, room by room, to reclaim what had been lost in a single night. For 26 days, the battle for Hue raged with the intensity of a fever dream. The Marines learned urban warfare in the most brutal classroom imaginable, fighting an enemy that knew every alley, every rooftop, every hidden tunnel. They learned to read the signs of booby traps in the way a building leaned, to recognize the sound of sniper fire by its echo off ancient walls, to distinguish between the cry of a wounded enemy and the call of a wounded friend. The South Vietnamese forces, who had been dismissed by many American advisors as unreliable, fought with the desperation of men defending their own homes. They knew the streets of Hue like their own faces, could navigate the maze of alleys and courtyards, even in the darkness of a city under siege. Their casualties were enormous, but their determination was absolute. This was not just a military objective, but the heart of their civilization. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters who had infiltrated the city moved with the confidence of men who had prepared for this moment for years. They had studied the city's layout, had identified sympathizers who could provide safe houses, had cached weapons and supplies in hiding places that the Americans would never find. They fought with the knowledge that this was their moment, their chance to prove that the American war machine was not invincible. The television coverage of Tet brought the war into American living rooms with an immediacy that was shocking even to a population that had grown accustomed to nightly news reports from Vietnam. The images were not the sanitized briefings from the Pentagon, but raw footage of American soldiers fighting for their lives, of Vietnamese civilians caught in crossfire, of a war that clearly had no end in sight. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in American journalism, delivered his famous assessment that the war was stalemated, that victory was no longer possible, that the time had come to negotiate a way out. His words carried the weight of a man who had seen too much suffering, who had lost faith in the promises of progress that had sustained the war effort for so long. But the fighting continued with a momentum that seemed to have nothing to do with strategy or politics. In the villages around Hue, peasants who had never taken sides in the war found themselves forced to choose between the government troops who controlled the roads and the communist forces who controlled the countryside. Families were split not just by ideology, but by the simple geography of survival, which side of the fighting line they happened to be on when the shooting started. The American soldiers who fought in Tet learned lessons that no training manual could teach. They learned that their enemy was not the peasant militia they had been told to expect, but a disciplined army capable of coordinated operations across an entire country. They learned that the war was not being won by the gradual progress their commanders claimed, but was locked in a stalemate that consumed lives without producing victory. the psychological impact of Tet was perhaps greater than its military significance. The offensive had been repelled, the cities retaken, the enemy forces decimated, but the cost in credibility, in public support, in the morale of the troops themselves was enormous. The war that had been sold as a limited intervention to support a friendly government had become a full-scale conflict with no clear path to victory. In the aftermath of Tet, the American strategy began to shift from winning the war to finding a way out of it. The peace negotiations that had been dismissed as premature suddenly seemed like the only rational course. The draft calls that had been accepted as necessary suddenly seemed like the sacrifice of a generation for a cause that no one could clearly define. The Vietnamese people, who had endured the fighting with the stoicism of those who had survived centuries of invasion, began to sense that change was coming. The Americans, who had arrived with such confidence and such firepower, were beginning to look like every other foreign army that had ever come to Vietnam. Powerful but temporary, dangerous but ultimately irrelevant to the deeper currents of Vietnamese history. The moon that had witnessed the Tet offensive continued its ancient cycle, waxing and waning with the indifference of celestial bodies to human suffering. But the war had changed, had revealed its true nature as a conflict that could not be won by any army, that would consume everything it touched, that would leave scars on the land and the people that would last for generations. In the darkness after Tet, mothers in America and Vietnam said the same prayers they had been saying for years, asking for their sons to come home, for the war to end, for the world to make sense again. But the darkness was deeper now, and the light seemed farther away than ever. The morning mist clung to the hills of the A Shau Valley like the breath of sleeping dragons, and in that ethereal whiteness, Hill 937 rose like a green monument to the futility of war. The soldiers who would come to call it Hamburger Hill could not have known, as they began their assault on May 10, 1969, that they were about to participate in a battle that would symbolize everything that was wrong with the American strategy in Vietnam. The hill had no strategic value beyond its position on the map, no vital supply lines to cut, no enemy headquarters to capture. It was simply there, occupied by North Vietnamese forces who had turned its slopes into a maze of bunkers and tunnels, who had sown its approaches with mines and booby traps, who had prepared to sell every inch of ground at the highest possible price in American blood. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been given the mission of taking this hill as part of Operation Apache Snow, a search and destroy mission that was designed to disrupt enemy supply lines and base camps. The men who would climb those slopes were seasoned veterans of jungle warfare, soldiers who had learned to move through the green hell of Vietnam with the cautious grace of predators who knew they were also prey. The first assault began at dawn, the soldiers moving up the steep slopes through jungle so thick that they could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The trees seemed to press in on them like the walls of a living cathedral, their canopy so dense that the morning light filtered down in scattered beams that illuminated patches of green hell. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation, a perfume that would cling to their uniforms and their memories long after the battle ended. The North Vietnamese defenders had chosen their ground well. Every approach to the summit was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every tree and boulder had been turned into a fortified position. They had lived on this hill for months, had grown to know its every contour and shadow, had prepared killing fields where American soldiers would die, with the mechanical precision of men feeding rice into a threshing machine. The sound of gunfire echoed across the valley like thunder that would not end, punctuated by the sharper crack of grenades and the whistling descent of mortar rounds. The soldiers learned to distinguish between the different sounds of death, the snap of AK-47 fire that meant close contact, the deeper thump of heavy machine guns that could cut a man in half, the metallic ping of shrapnel bouncing off trees and rocks. For 10 days, the battle raged with an intensity that seemed to drain color from the world itself. The soldiers fought their way up slopes that were slippery with blood and rain, over ground that had been churned into mud by artillery and the passage of desperate men. They learned that heroism was not glorious but exhausting, that courage was not fearlessness but action despite fear, that brotherhood was forged in the crucible of shared suffering. The medics worked with the efficiency of emergency room doctors, treating wounds that ranged from minor cuts to injuries that would require letters to parents who had never imagined their sons dying on a hill in a country they could not pronounce. The helicopters came and went like mechanical angels, carrying away the wounded and bringing in fresh ammunition, their rotors beating the air into submission as they hovered over landing zones that were under constant fire. The soldiers who fought on Hamburger Hill came from every corner of America. Farm boys from Iowa who had never seen a jungle, city kids from Detroit who had never imagined such silence between the gunfire, college dropouts who had chosen the army over Vietnam protests, and volunteers who still believed in the mission even as it consumed their friends. They shared their rations and their fears, their cigarettes and their prayers, their last letters home, and their first taste of combat. The enemy they fought was equally diverse. North Vietnamese regulars who had been fighting Americans for years, local Viet Cong who knew every trail and hiding place, teenage soldiers who had marched down the Ho Chi Minh Trail carrying weapons and dreams of liberation. They fought with the desperation of defenders and the confidence of soldiers who knew that time was on their side, that America's patience was not infinite, that every American death brought them closer to ultimate victory. On May 20th, after 10 days of fighting that had cost 72 American lives and wounded 372 others, the summit of Hill 937 was finally taken. The soldiers who reached the top found bunkers that had been constructed with the skill of master carpenters, tunnels that connected positions in a network, that spoke of months of preparation, and the bodies of enemies who had chosen to die rather than retreat. But the victory was hollow in ways that military statistics could never capture. Within days of taking the hill, the American forces were ordered to abandon it, to move on to other objectives in the endless cycle of search and destroy missions that characterized the American strategy. The hill that had cost so much blood was left to the jungle, to grow back over the bomb craters and bunkers, to heal the scars of a battle that had accomplished nothing except the demonstration of American willingness to die for meaningless objectives. The news of Hamburger Hill reached the American public at a time when support for the war was already crumbling. The images of wounded soldiers being carried off helicopters, the interviews with exhausted GIs questioning why they had been asked to die for a hill that would be abandoned, the growing body count with no corresponding progress toward victory, all of it contributed to a sense that the war had lost any coherent purpose. Senator Edward Kennedy called the battle senseless and irresponsible, a waste of American lives for no strategic gain. The protests that had been growing on college campuses spread to Main Street America, to families who had supported the war effort but could no longer understand what their sons were dying for. The gap between the official optimism of military briefings and the reality being reported by soldiers in the field had become too wide to bridge. But for the soldiers who had fought on those slopes, the political debates were irrelevant to the memories they would carry forever. They had learned lessons about themselves and their country that no classroom could teach, that ordinary men could do extraordinary things under extraordinary circumstances, that the line between civilization and savagery was thinner than anyone wanted to believe, that the cost of war could never be calculated in purely military terms. The jungle began to reclaim Hill 937 within weeks of the American withdrawal. the green tendrils of tropical growth covering the scars of battle, with the patient persistence of nature healing itself. The bunkers filled with rainwater and rotting leaves, the weapons emplacements became homes for the birds and monkeys that had fled during the fighting. The trails that had been marked with blood and tears disappeared under new growth. But the hill would remain in the memories of those who had fought there, a green monument to the complexity of a war that defied simple explanations. It had been a military victory that felt like a defeat, a tactical success that highlighted strategic failure, a demonstration of American military power that revealed the limits of that power when applied to problems that could not be solved by force alone. In the villages around the Aishau Valley, the old women who had survived French colonialism and Japanese occupation and Chinese invasions added Hamburger Hill to their catalogue of foreign battles fought on Vietnamese soil. They had seen armies come and go, had watched young men die for causes that seemed important to distant capitals, but irrelevant to the daily business of planting rice and raising children and honoring ancestors. The moon that had witnessed the battle continued its ancient cycle, indifferent to human suffering but constant in its presence above the hills where young men had learned the true cost of war. And in the darkness, the survivors of Hamburger Hill began the long journey home, carrying with them questions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. While the world's attention was focused on the rice paddies and jungles of Vietnam, another war was being fought in the mountains and valleys of Laos, a conflict so secret that it would remain hidden from the American people for years after it ended. The Kingdom of Laos, with its ancient Buddhist temples and its timeless rhythms of rural life, had become a battlefield in the larger struggle for Southeast Asia, though officially no American combat troops were fighting there. The mountains of Laos rose like sleeping giants from the green carpet of jungle, their peaks shrouded in mists that seemed to hold the secrets of centuries. In these mountains, the Hmong people had lived for generations, tending their crops of rice and opium, following traditions that had been passed down through countless seasons of war and peace. They were a proud people, fiercely independent, who had never bowed to any lowland king or foreign master. Now they found themselves at the center of a war they had never chosen, recruited by the CIA to fight a proxy battle against the North Vietnamese forces who were using Laotian territory as a supply route to South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail snaked through these mountains like a living thing, a network of paths and roads that carried the lifeblood of the communist war effort: weapons and ammunition, medical supplies and food, fresh troops and veteran cadres. The CIA agents who worked with the Hmong were a different breed from the conventional military officers fighting in Vietnam. They operated in the shadows, men with no names and no official existence who spoke fluent Hmong and understood the complex clan politics that governed mountain society. They brought weapons and training, radios and promises, but most importantly, they brought hope that the Hmong could preserve their way of life in a world that was changing too fast to comprehend. General Vang Pao became the leader of this secret army, a man who could navigate equally well between the ancient traditions of his people and the modern requirements of guerrilla warfare. He was a soldier politician who understood that the war in Laos was not just about military objectives, but about the survival of his people as a distinct culture. Under his leadership, the Hmong fought with a determination that amazed their American advisors and terrified their communist enemies. The air war over Laos was unlike anything seen before in human history. American bombers flew round-the-clock missions, dropping more ordnance on this small, neutral country than had been dropped on Germany during all of World War II. The ancient plain of jars, where stone vessels left by unknown civilizations had stood for thousands of years, became a moonscape of bomb craters. The thunder of B-52s became as regular as the monsoon rains, and the children learned to recognize the different sounds of different aircraft the way their grandparents had learned to identify birds by their songs. The bombing campaign, known as Operation Barrel Roll and later Operation Steel Tiger, was conducted with the bureaucratic precision of men who reduced human suffering to statistics and strategic objectives to map coordinates. The pilots who flew these missions saw targets, not villages, grid squares, not homes, objectives, not lives. They could not hear the prayers being whispered in bomb shelters or see the faces of children who had learned to sleep through the sound of falling bombs. But the bombing was not random destruction. It was part of a larger strategy to interdict the flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to make it impossible for North Vietnam to sustain its war effort in the south. The trail was more than a road. It was a circulatory system that kept the communist forces alive, and the Americans were determined to cut it, no matter what the cost. The North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces responded to the bombing with the ingenuity of engineers and the determination of men fighting for their homeland. They moved supplies at night, hid during the day, built roads that could be quickly repaired after air attacks. They used elephants and bicycles, trucks and human porters, creating a logistics network that was both primitive and sophisticated, ancient and modern. The Hmong fighters learned to fight a war that existed in the gaps between the official policies of great powers. They received American weapons but wore no uniforms, fought under no flag, had no official existence in any war college textbook. They developed tactics that combined traditional mountain warfare with modern technology, using radios to call in airstrikes while moving through terrain that had been their ancestors' hunting grounds. The villages that served as bases for these operations became military installations disguised as farming communities. Rice paddies were converted into helicopter landing zones, traditional longhouses became ammunition depots, and children learned to spot enemy aircraft while herding water buffalo. The war transformed every aspect of daily life, turning peaceful farmers into soldiers and ancient cultural practices into military tactics. The casualties among the Hmong were enormous, disproportionate to their small population. Entire clans lost their young men to a war that promised freedom, but delivered only more fighting. The traditional social structure that had governed Hmong society for centuries began to crack under the pressure of constant warfare, as military necessity took precedence over cultural continuity. The refugee camps that sprouted throughout Laos were filled with people who had been displaced not once but many times, families who had fled from village to village as the fighting spread across their homeland like a forest fire. They carried what they could, photographs and jewelry, tools and memories, but left behind the graves of their ancestors and the places where their culture had taken root. The American advisors who worked with the Hmong developed relationships that went far beyond military cooperation. They learned to speak the language, to understand the cultural nuances that governed clan relationships, to appreciate the complexity of a society that had survived for centuries in one of the world's most remote regions. Some came to love the Hmong people with the intensity of men who had found a second family in the midst of war. But the secret war could not remain secret forever. As the conflict in Vietnam dragged on and American casualties mounted, questions began to be asked about the broader scope of American involvement in Southeast Asia. Journalists and congressional investigators started to uncover the truth about operations that had been hidden from public view, about a war that was being fought with American money and weapons, but without American acknowledgement. The revelation of the secret war in Laos added another layer of controversy to an already unpopular conflict. The American people learned that their government had been fighting multiple wars simultaneously, that the commitment to Southeast Asia was far larger than they had been told, that the web of involvement was more complex than anyone had imagined. For the Hmong, the exposure of the secret war was a disaster that threatened their very survival. They had fought for the Americans with the understanding that their alliance would remain hidden, that they would be protected by the anonymity that had shielded them from communist reprisals. Now they were exposed as American collaborators, marked for death by enemies who had long memories and patient hearts. The mountains of Laos continued to echo with the sound of gunfire and the whisper of helicopter rotors, but the nature of the conflict was changing. The secret war was becoming another front in a larger battle for American credibility, another chapter in a story that seemed to have no ending, another burden for a nation that was growing weary of carrying the weight of the world. In the mists that clung to the mountain peaks, the spirits of the ancestors watched as their descendants fought a war that would determine not just the political future of Southeast Asia, but the cultural survival of peoples who had never asked to be part of anyone's grand strategy. The ancient rhythms of rice planting and harvest, of birth and death and renewal, continued beneath the thunder of modern war, but they were muted now, almost drowned out by the sound of a world that was forgetting how to be at peace. The year 1970 arrived like a fever breaking, bringing with it the realization that the war had grown beyond anyone's ability to control or understand. The invasion of Cambodia in April shattered the illusion that the conflict could be contained within the borders of Vietnam, revealing the true scope of a regional war that had been hidden behind diplomatic fictions and bureaucratic compartmentalization. President Nixon had promised peace with honor, a gradual withdrawal of American forces coupled with the strengthening of South Vietnamese capabilities. But the discovery of massive North Vietnamese base camps and supply depots in supposedly neutral Cambodia forced a decision that would fracture American society along lines that had been forming for years. The secret bombing of Cambodia, which had been going on for over a year, would become public knowledge, adding another layer of deception to a war built on half-truths and wishful thinking. The American soldiers who crossed the border into Cambodia found a landscape that was both familiar and alien, the same green jungle and red clay, the same oppressive humidity and constant threat of ambush, but overlaid with the knowledge that they were now fighting in a third country, expanding a war that was supposed to be winding down. The Cambodian people, who had managed to remain largely outside the conflict, suddenly found themselves in the center of a storm that would destroy their ancient civilization. The temples of Angkor Wat, those stone monuments to the glory of the Khmer Empire, stood as silent witnesses to this new phase of destruction. For 800 years they had survived the rise and fall of kingdoms, the invasions of neighboring peoples, the slow encroachment of jungle vines, and time itself. Now they watched as modern war came to their peaceful countryside, bringing with it technologies of destruction that would have been incomprehensible to the god-kings who had built these monuments to eternity. On American college campuses, the news of the Cambodian invasion triggered protests that dwarfed anything that had come before. The students who had been organizing against the war for years were joined by middle-class Americans who had supported the government's policies but could no longer understand the logic of expansion in the name of withdrawal. The National Guard units that were called out to maintain order were composed of young men who might have been fighting in Vietnam, if not for the luck of birth dates and draft lottery numbers. At Kent State University in Ohio, the tensions that had been building for years exploded in a moment of gunfire that would echo through American history. On May 4th, as students gathered to protest the Cambodian invasion, National Guard troops opened fire, killing 4 students and wounding 9 others. The photographs of young Americans lying dead on their own campus, killed by other young Americans in uniform, became symbols of a nation at war with itself. The images from Kent State were transmitted around the world with the same immediacy as the pictures from Vietnam, creating a narrative that linked domestic protest with foreign war in ways that made both seem part of the same larger tragedy. The line between the war abroad and the conflict at home had been erased, replaced by a recognition that the cost of Vietnam was being paid not just by soldiers in rice paddies, but by students on college campuses. In Vietnam itself, the war continued with the mechanical persistence of a machine that could not be turned off. The Vietnamization program was proceeding according to schedule, with American combat units being replaced by South Vietnamese forces that were supposed to be capable of defending their own country. But the transition was complicated by the reality that the South Vietnamese military, despite years of American training and equipment, remained dependent on American support for everything from logistics to air power. The soldiers who were still fighting in Vietnam felt the weight of a war that was both ending and continuing, a conflict that was being reduced in scope while maintaining its deadly intensity. They knew that they were among the last Americans to fight in Vietnam, that their tour of duty might be the final chapter in a story that had consumed a generation. This knowledge gave their service a peculiar poignancy, the awareness that they were participating in a historical conclusion while living through daily experiences that felt anything but final. The Vietnamese people, who had endured the American presence for nearly a decade, began to sense that change was coming. The withdrawal of American troops was gradual but visible. The reduction in combat operations, noticeable even to civilians who had learned to gauge the intensity of the war by the sound of helicopters and the frequency of artillery fire. But the change brought uncertainty as much as hope. No one knew what would happen when the Americans were gone, whether the South Vietnamese government could survive without its foreign protector. The North Vietnamese leadership, meeting in their underground bunkers and mountain hideouts, watched the American withdrawal with the patience of farmers observing the changing seasons. They had always known that America's commitment to Vietnam was temporary, that sooner or later the American people would tire of a war that offered no clear victory and demanded such a high price in blood and treasure. Their strategy had been to outlast the Americans, to make the cost of staying higher than the cost of leaving. The peace negotiations in Paris had been going on for years, a diplomatic dance that seemed designed to delay rather than achieve resolution. The representatives from North Vietnam, South Vietnam, the United States, and the Viet Cong met regularly around tables where every detail, from the shape of the table to the order of speaking, had been negotiated with the same intensity as military operations. The talks provided a forum for propaganda and position-taking, but little progress toward actual peace. Henry Kissinger, the Harvard professor who had become Nixon's chief foreign policy advisor, engaged in secret negotiations that bypassed the formal peace talks. His meetings with North Vietnamese representatives in private houses in Paris created a parallel diplomatic track that was hidden from public view. Another layer of secrecy in a war that had been characterized by hidden operations and concealed objectives from its beginning. The American prisoners of war, held in the notorious Hanoi Hilton and other prison camps throughout North Vietnam, had become symbols of American sacrifice and communist brutality. Their families organized campaigns for their release, wearing POW bracelets and maintaining yellow ribbons as reminders of men who had disappeared into the black hole of enemy captivity. The prisoners themselves endured treatment that ranged from brutal torture to psychological warfare, maintaining their sanity through elaborate communication systems and stubborn resistance to indoctrination. John McCain, shot down over Hanoi in 1967, spent over 5 years in captivity, much of it in solitary confinement. His experience, like that of hundreds of other American prisoners, became a testament to human endurance and military honor. They created a shadow army of resistance behind enemy lines, maintaining military discipline and American values in conditions designed to break their spirits and turn them against their own country. The drug problem that had been growing among American troops in Vietnam reached crisis proportions as the war wound down. Soldiers who had volunteered or been drafted to fight for democracy found themselves using heroin and marijuana to escape the reality of a war that seemed to have no purpose, no progress, and no end. The military justice system struggled to deal with problems that had never existed in previous wars, not just the traditional issues of military discipline, but the broader questions of morale and motivation in a conflict that lacked public support. The racial tensions that existed in American society were magnified in the artificial environment of military service in Vietnam. Black soldiers, who were disproportionately represented in combat units and casualty lists, began to question why they were fighting for freedom in Southeast Asia when they lacked basic civil rights in their own country. The civil rights movement that had been gaining momentum during the early years of the war now intersected with the anti-war movement in ways that created new coalitions and new contradictions. Martin Luther King Jr., who had initially avoided taking a position on Vietnam, finally spoke out against the war in 1967, declaring that America was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. His opposition to the war cost him support among moderate whites who had backed his civil rights efforts but could not accept his criticism of American foreign policy. The assassination of King in 1968 removed one of the few voices that might have been able to bridge the gap between the civil rights and anti-war movements. The fabric of American society, which had seemed so strong and unified during World War II, was unraveling under the pressure of a war that divided families, communities, and institutions. The consensus that had supported American involvement in world affairs since 1945 was breaking down, replaced by a more questioning attitude toward authority and a more skeptical view of government claims about foreign threats and military necessities. As 1970 turned into 1971, the war in Vietnam had become something that America was doing to itself, as much as something it was doing to Southeast Asia. The divisions at home were as deep as any bomb crater, the wounds as lasting as any battlefield injury. The question was no longer whether America would leave Vietnam, but what kind of country it would be when the war finally ended. The summer of 1971 brought revelations that would shake the foundations of American democracy and forever change the relationship between the government and the governed. On June 13th, the New York Times began publishing excerpts from a classified study that would become known as the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret history of American involvement in Vietnam that revealed decades of deception, miscalculation, and deliberate lies told to the American people by their own government. Daniel Ellsberg, a former Pentagon analyst who had helped write portions of the study, had spent sleepless nights photocopying the 7,000-page document, driven by a moral conviction that the American people deserved to know the truth about a war that had claimed over 58,000 American lives and countless Vietnamese casualties. His decision to leak the papers was not taken lightly. He knew that he faced potential life imprisonment for violating the Espionage Act, but he also knew that the truth was more important than his personal safety. The papers revealed that 4 presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had systematically misled Congress and the public about the nature and scope of American involvement in Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which had been used to justify the massive escalation of 1964, was shown to have been far more ambiguous than the public had been told. The optimistic assessments that had been given to the press and Congress were contradicted by private assessments that painted a much bleaker picture of American prospects. The revelation that the government had been lying about Vietnam for decades hit the American public like a physical blow. Families who had lost sons in the war learned that their sacrifices had been based on false premises and hidden agendas. Veterans who had served with honor discovered that the mission they had risked their lives for had been founded on deceptions that went back to the very beginning of American involvement. The Nixon administration's response to the Pentagon Papers leak revealed the paranoid mindset that would eventually lead to Watergate and the collapse of the presidency. Instead of acknowledging the legitimacy of public debate about Vietnam policy, the administration sought to suppress the papers through court injunctions and to punish those responsible for their release. The creation of the White House Plumbers, a secret unit designed to stop leaks and discredit critics, marked a turning point toward the abuse of executive power that would define the Nixon years. In Vietnam itself, the American withdrawal continued according to the timetable established by Vietnamization, but the revelations in the Pentagon Papers cast doubt on everything the public had been told about the war's progress. The South Vietnamese forces that were supposed to take over from departing American units were revealed to have serious weaknesses that had been hidden from public view. The enemy strength estimates that had been consistently lowballed in public briefings were shown to have been manipulated to support political objectives rather than military reality. The air war that continued despite the troop withdrawals took on an increasingly desperate character, as American commanders tried to use bombing to achieve objectives that ground forces had been unable to accomplish. The B-52 raids that had been sold as precise surgical strikes were revealed through leaked documents and investigative reporting to be area bombardments that killed civilians and destroyed infrastructure with little military effect. The Christmas bombing campaign of 1972, known as Operation Linebacker II, brought the full force of American air power to bear on North Vietnam in a final attempt to force a negotiated settlement. For 11 days, B-52 bombers pounded targets around Hanoi and Haiphong with a ferocity that shocked even seasoned observers of the war. The images of American prisoners of war being paraded through the streets of Hanoi after being shot down during these raids became powerful symbols of a war that had spiraled beyond any rational control. The North Vietnamese response to the Christmas bombing was to return to the Paris peace talks with a new willingness to compromise. But the cost in American credibility and international support was enormous. The bombing campaign was widely condemned around the world as a barbaric escalation that served no legitimate military purpose. The pilots who flew these missions knew that they were participating in the final act of a failed strategy, that their bombs were falling on a country that had already been bombed more heavily than Germany during World War II. The peace agreement that was finally signed in Paris on January 27, 1973, was less a resolution of the conflict than a face-saving formula that allowed the United States to withdraw its remaining forces while maintaining the fiction that South Vietnam remained viable. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all American forces, the return of prisoners of war, and the eventual reunification of Vietnam through peaceful means. But everyone who signed the document knew that it was a temporary truce rather than a lasting peace. The American prisoners of war who were released in Operation Homecoming during the spring of 1973 returned to a country that had changed dramatically during their years of captivity. The returning POWs were greeted as heroes, symbols of American endurance and military honor, but they also found themselves thrust into political debates about the war that many of them were ill-equipped to navigate. Their stories of torture and resistance provided powerful ammunition for those who argued that the war had been worth fighting, even if it had been poorly conducted. But the homecoming of the POWs could not disguise the reality that America was abandoning South Vietnam to its fate. The last American combat troops left Vietnam on March 29, 1973, ending direct American involvement in a war that had lasted over a decade and fundamentally changed American society. The departure was conducted with minimal ceremony, There were no victory parades, no celebrations, just the quiet withdrawal of an army that had not achieved its objectives. The South Vietnamese forces that remained behind faced an impossible task: defending a country that had been dependent on American support for its very existence against an enemy that controlled substantial territory and enjoyed the backing of major powers. The corruption and incompetence that had plagued the South Vietnamese government throughout the war became even more pronounced as American oversight and assistance were withdrawn. The American public, exhausted by years of war and disillusioned by the revelations of government deception, wanted nothing more than to forget about Vietnam and move on to other concerns. The returning veterans found themselves in the uncomfortable position of representing a war that their countrymen preferred not to discuss, a conflict that had become associated with failure and dishonor rather than courage and sacrifice. The anti-war movement that had mobilized millions of Americans against the war began to dissolve as American involvement ended, but the broader questions that the war had raised about American power and purpose remained unresolved. The Pentagon Papers had revealed not just specific deceptions about Vietnam, but a broader pattern of government secrecy and manipulation that extended far beyond Southeast Asia. The legacy of the Pentagon Papers extended far beyond their immediate impact on the Vietnam War. They established important precedents for press freedom and the public's right to know, principles that would be tested repeatedly in subsequent decades. They also contributed to a broader erosion of trust in government that would shape American politics for generations to come. As the last American helicopters lifted off from Vietnamese soil, they carried with them the weight of a failed enterprise that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of dollars. But they also carried the lessons that would shape American foreign policy for decades to come. Lessons about the limits of military power, the importance of public support, and the dangers of policies based on deception rather than truth. The war was over for America, but it was far from over for Vietnam. The real tragedy was yet to come, as the country that had been torn apart by decades of fighting would face its final, most destructive chapter without the American forces that had become both its protector and its burden. The spring of 1975 arrived in Vietnam like a season of endings, carrying with it the scent of defeat that no amount of diplomatic language could disguise. The American forces had been gone for 2 years, but their absence hung over South Vietnam like the shadow of a departed lover, a constant reminder of abandonment and the approaching darkness. In the hills around Pleiku and the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta, the South Vietnamese army held positions that everyone knew were untenable, waiting for an attack that would come with the inevitability of monsoon rains. The North Vietnamese had spent the 2 years since the Paris Peace Accords rebuilding their forces and improving their supply lines, turning the Ho Chi Minh Trail into a modern highway capable of moving tanks and heavy artillery. The trucks that had once crept through jungle paths under cover of darkness now moved in broad daylight, their drivers confident that American bombers would not return to challenge their passage. The acoustic sensors that the Americans had left behind recorded the sound of an army on the move, but there was no one left to respond to their electronic warnings. President Thieu, who had ruled South Vietnam under American protection for 8 years, found himself in the impossible position of defending a country with an army that had been trained to fight alongside American forces, not in place of them. The South Vietnamese military had never developed the independent capabilities that Vietnamization was supposed to create. They remained dependent on American logistics, American air support, American intelligence, and American will. When those supports were removed, the entire structure began to collapse with stunning speed. The final offensive began on March 10th, with attacks on the central highland city of Ban Mi Thuot, a strategic crossroads that controlled the movement of troops and supplies between the coast and the interior. The North Vietnamese forces that overran the city were not the black pajama guerrillas of American imagination, but regular army units equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery, supported by engineers who could build bridges and sappers who could take fortified positions. They moved with the confidence of soldiers who knew that time and momentum were on their side. The fall of Ban Me Thot triggered a cascade of retreats and surrenders that accelerated with each passing day. President Thieu's decision to abandon the Central Highlands and concentrate his forces around Saigon and the Mekong Delta might have made military sense, but it had the psychological effect of a dam bursting. The civilian population, seeing their own army in retreat, began to flee southward in massive numbers, clogging the roads with refugees and making military movements impossible. The highways leading south became rivers of human misery, streams of people carrying everything they owned on their backs or in overloaded vehicles that broke down under the weight of desperate flight. Families that had lived in the same villages for generations found themselves walking toward an uncertain future, carrying children who cried for homes they would never see again. The lucky ones rode in buses or trucks. The others walked, their bare feet raising clouds of red dust that coated everything with the color of dried blood. In the provincial capitals that fell one by one to the advancing North Vietnamese, the last Americans, diplomats and contractors, missionaries and aid workers, evacuated with the haste of people who had suddenly realized that their time was up. The helicopter evacuations from rooftops became symbols of American abandonment, images that would haunt the American conscience for decades to come. The Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans, who had trusted in American promises of protection, found themselves trapped between their advancing enemies and their departing allies. The speed of the collapse surprised even the North Vietnamese commanders, who had planned for a campaign that would last into 1976, but found themselves racing to keep up with their own success. Units that had expected to fight for every village found empty positions and abandoned equipment. South Vietnamese soldiers who had shed their uniforms and melted into the civilian population. The war that had lasted for decades was ending in a matter of weeks. The final act compressed into a span of time that left everyone struggling to understand what was happening. Saigon in those final weeks became a city of frayed nerves and desperate hope, a place where rumors flew faster than facts, and every helicopter that appeared on the horizon might be bringing rescue or bombardment. The American embassy, that symbol of foreign power that had stood like a fortress in the heart of the city for over a decade, became a magnet for Vietnamese who hoped that their association with America would earn them a seat on one of the evacuation flights. The bars and brothels that had catered to American soldiers continued to operate with surreal normalcy, serving drinks to customers who might not be there the next day, hosting parties that felt like wakes for a civilization that was dying. The Vietnamese employees of American organizations continued to report to work, even as their bosses prepared evacuation plans that did not include them, maintaining professional routines that had become absurd but provided psychological anchor in a world that was dissolving around them. Ambassador Graham Martin, the last American ambassador to South Vietnam, clung to the hope that a negotiated settlement might still be possible, that the advancing North Vietnamese might be willing to accept something less than total victory. His reluctance to begin a full evacuation until the last possible moment reflected not just diplomatic optimism, but the psychological difficulty of acknowledging the complete failure of a policy that had consumed so much American effort and sacrifice. The evacuation of Saigon, when it finally came, unfolded with the chaotic desperation of a ship abandoning a sinking vessel. Operation Frequent Wind began on April 29th, as North Vietnamese artillery shells began falling on Tan Son Nhut Airport, making fixed-wing evacuations impossible. The helicopters that lifted off from the embassy rooftop and other landing zones around the city carried not just Americans, but thousands of Vietnamese who had earned passage through their service to the American cause. Interpreters and intelligence agents, government officials and military officers, anyone who could prove their loyalty to a cause that was now lost. But for every Vietnamese who escaped, dozens were left behind. The embassy gates, which had been opened to allow the fortunate few to enter, were surrounded by crowds of people who pressed against the barriers with the desperation of the drowning. The Marines who guarded those gates faced impossible choices: whom to admit, whom to turn away, how to maintain order while the world collapsed around them. The images of helicopters lifting off from rooftops, while desperate people clung to their landing skids, became emblems of American abandonment and Vietnamese tragedy. The last helicopter to leave the embassy rooftop departed at 7:53 a.m. on April 30th, carrying Ambassador Martin and the final American personnel. 11 Marines remained behind to destroy classified documents and communications equipment, the last American soldiers to serve in Vietnam. They were evacuated 45 minutes later, their departure marking the end of the longest war in American history. At 11:30 a.m. on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, their treads crushing the manicured lawns where diplomats had once strolled, and their commanders accepting the surrender of a government that had ceased to exist. President Duong Van Minh, who had been in office for only 2 days, formally surrendered to Colonel Bui Tin of the North Vietnamese Army, ending a war that had raged for 30 years and a division that had split the country for 21 years. The silence that followed the surrender was profound, broken only by the sound of North Vietnamese soldiers moving through empty government buildings and the distant echo of celebration in the streets where supporters of the communist cause emerged from years of hiding. The war was over, but the peace that followed would bring its own tragedies. Re-education camps for former South Vietnamese officials, boat people fleeing by sea, the slow transformation of a war-torn country into a unified socialist state. For the Americans watching on television from half a world away, the fall of Saigon represented more than military defeat. It marked the end of an era of American confidence and the beginning of a long period of national soul-searching. The country that had entered World War II as the arsenal of democracy and emerged as the leader of the free world now faced the reality that military power alone could not solve political problems, that good intentions were not enough to transform foreign societies, that the costs of global leadership could exceed its benefits. The veterans who had fought in Vietnam found themselves in the unique position of having served in a war that their country preferred to forget, of representing a cause that had been abandoned, of carrying wounds both physical and psychological from a conflict that had produced no victory parades or grateful nation. They returned to a society that was divided about the war's meaning and unsure how to honor their service while acknowledging the war's failure. In the rice paddies and rubber plantations where so much blood had been spilled, the physical scars of war would take decades to heal. The bomb craters filled with water and became fish ponds. The abandoned fire bases were reclaimed by jungle growth. The landing zones where helicopters had brought young men to war became clearings, where children played. But the chemical defoliants that had stripped the leaves from ancient trees would continue to poison the soil for generations, and the unexploded ordnance buried in fields and forests would claim lives long after the shooting stopped. The refugee camps in Thailand and the Philippines filled with Vietnamese boat people who had chosen the uncertainty of exile over the certainty of life under communist rule. These refugees carried with them Not just the trauma of war, but the deeper tragedy of a homeland that had been lost, a culture that had been scattered, families that had been divided by political lines that cut deeper than any national boundary. The children who had grown up during the war, both American and Vietnamese, would carry its legacy into adulthood, shaping their understanding of government and authority, of war and peace, of what it meant to be patriotic in a democracy that had lost its way. The anti-war protesters who had challenged their government's policies would find that victory in the streets did not translate into solutions for the complex problems that had made the war seem necessary in the first place. Ho Chi Minh, the leader who had inspired North Vietnamese resistance for decades, had died in 1969 before he could see the fulfillment of his dream of a united Vietnam. But his vision of a country free from foreign domination had finally been realized, even if the cost in human suffering had been almost beyond calculation. The Vietnam that emerged from 30 years of war was united, but exhausted, victorious but devastated, independent but isolated from much of the world by the ideological divisions of the Cold War. The American soldiers who had fought in Vietnam would spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of their experience, to find meaning in a war that seemed to have accomplished nothing except the demonstration of the limits of American power. Some would find that meaning in the brotherhood they had forged with fellow soldiers, in the courage they had shown under impossible circumstances, in the simple fact that they had done their duty as they understood it. Others would struggle with questions that had no satisfactory answers, why they had been asked to fight for objectives that were never clearly defined, why they had been sent to support a government that lacked popular support, why their sacrifices had been wasted in pursuit of goals that proved unattainable. The war would remain an open wound in the American psyche, a source of division and debate that would influence foreign policy decisions for decades to come. As the dust settled over the ruins of Saigon and the last echoes of gunfire faded into memory, the world began the long process of understanding what the Vietnam War had meant and what its lessons were for future generations. The war had been many things to many people: a crusade for freedom, an exercise in imperial overreach, a test of American resolve, a demonstration of the power of popular resistance. But perhaps most of all, it had been a human tragedy on an enormous scale, a reminder that wars fought for abstract principles exact their price in very concrete suffering, that the grand strategies of great powers are implemented by young men and women who bleed and die for causes they may not fully understand. The Vietnam War was over, but its echoes would resonate through history like the sound of distant thunder, a reminder of the cost of hubris and the price of good intentions gone wrong. The war had ended, but its cruelest chapter was yet to be written in the waters of the South China Sea, where wooden boats barely seaworthy enough for river fishing were launched into the open ocean, carrying human cargo more precious than any treasure. The boat people of Vietnam began their exodus in the years following 1975, fleeing not just a country, but a way of life that had been extinguished as surely as a candle blown out by the wind. The re-education camps that had been promised as brief periods of political instruction became years-long sentences of hard labor and ideological conversion for hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers, government officials, and anyone who had been associated with the American presence. The families of these men found themselves marked as enemies of the people, their children denied education, their property confiscated, their very existence made precarious by association with the losing side. In the cities and towns of the former South Vietnam, the new government began the systematic transformation of society according to socialist principles that had little connection to Vietnamese traditions or practical realities. Private businesses were nationalized, land was redistributed, and the entire economic structure that had developed during the war years was dismantled with the thoroughness of demolition crews tearing down a condemned building. The ethnic Chinese who had lived in Vietnam for generations, who had operated the small businesses and trading networks that kept the economy functioning, found themselves particularly vulnerable to the new regime's suspicions. Ancient prejudices against the Chinese minority were given new political justification, and what had been discrimination became systematic persecution. Entire families decided that exile was preferable to the slow strangulation of their livelihoods and their children's futures. The boats that carried these refugees were never meant for ocean voyages. They were fishing vessels designed for coastal waters, river boats adapted for a purpose their builders had never imagined, anything that could float and carry human beings away from a homeland that had become uninhabitable. The families who boarded these vessels brought with them whatever gold and jewelry they could hide, sewing precious metals into the linings of clothes and the soles of shoes, carrying their entire life savings in forms that could survive a journey into the unknown. The departure was always at night, always in secret, always with the knowledge that detection would mean imprisonment or death. The refugees gathered at hidden beaches and river mouths, waiting for signals from smugglers who charged enormous fees for passage on vessels that might or might not reach their destination. Children were given sleeping pills to keep them quiet during the crucial hours when the boat had to slip past patrol vessels and reach international waters. Once at sea, the refugees faced dangers that made the war they had fled seem almost comfortable by comparison. The boats were overcrowded to the point where passengers could barely move, packed with humanity like cargo in the holds of slave ships. The engines, most of them ancient and poorly maintained, failed with monotonous regularity, leaving boats full of people drifting helplessly in seas that could turn violent without warning. The South China Sea, which had been crossed by merchants and pilgrims for thousands of years, became a vast cemetery for those who had chosen freedom over security. The boats that broke apart in storms took entire families to the bottom, leaving no trace except the occasional piece of wreckage that washed ashore on distant beaches. The statistics would never capture the full scope of the tragedy. No one knew exactly how many boats had been launched, how many people had died, how many families had simply vanished into the blue immensity of the ocean. Those who survived the voyage faced new horrors in the form of pirates who patrolled the shipping lanes like sharks scenting blood. The Thai pirates who attacked refugee boats were not romantic figures from adventure stories, but brutal criminals who raped women, murdered men, and threw children overboard with the casual cruelty of men who had learned to see their victims as something less than human. The few survivors who made it to shore carried stories of atrocities that were almost too horrible to believe. The first refugee camps were established on remote islands and coastal areas where governments could warehouse the boat people while deciding what to do with them. Pulau Bidong, a small Malaysian island that had been uninhabited, became home to over 40,000 Vietnamese refugees who lived in conditions that would have been condemned as inhumane for animals. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by soldiers, not to keep enemies out, but to keep the refugees in. Life in the camps was a kind of suspended animation, a limbo between the homeland that had been lost and the new countries that might or might not accept them. Families lived in bamboo huts or tents that provided little protection from monsoon rains or tropical heat, depending on international charity for food, that was often inadequate and medical care that was sporadic at best. Children grew up speaking the languages of their refugee camps, rather than Vietnamese, their cultural identity diluted by displacement and uncertainty. The international response to the boat people crisis was complicated by the Cold War politics that had helped create the problem in the first place. Western countries that had supported South Vietnam during the war felt some obligation to accept its refugees. but they were reluctant to open their doors to unlimited immigration from Southeast Asia. The result was a complex system of quotas and preferences that separated families and created new categories of human worth based on skills, education, and connections. The United States, which bore primary responsibility for the war that had created the refugee crisis, eventually accepted over 800,000 Vietnamese refugees, making them one of the largest immigrant groups in American history. But the process was slow and bureaucratic, requiring years of waiting in camps while applications were processed and security checks completed. Many refugees learned English and American customs while living in temporary housing, preparing for a life in a country they knew only through movies and government propaganda. The refugees who were eventually resettled in Western countries found themselves caught between worlds, too Vietnamese for their new homes and too Americanized for the homeland they had left behind. They opened restaurants and nail salons, worked in factories and offices, sent their children to schools where they excelled academically while struggling with cultural identity. The first generation carried the trauma of war and displacement, while their children grew up as Americans or Canadians or Australians who happened to have Vietnamese faces. The communities that formed in places like Orange County, California, or Arlington, Virginia, became little Vietnams where the culture and language of the homeland could be preserved and transmitted to new generations. The temples and community centers, the newspapers and television programs, the festivals and ceremonies all served to maintain connections to a country that existed now more in memory than in reality. But the refugees also brought with them a fierce anti-communist sentiment that would influence American politics for decades. They supported conservative politicians who promised to maintain pressure on the government that had driven them from their homes, and they opposed any normalization of relations with Vietnam that did not include significant political changes. Their votes and their activism kept the wounds of the Vietnam War open long after most Americans wanted to move on. The boat people who continued to flee Vietnam throughout the 1980s and 1990s found themselves increasingly unwelcome as the initial sympathy for refugees was replaced by concerns about economic competition and cultural assimilation. The camps that had been temporary refuges became permanent settlements, and the international community began to pressure refugees to return to Vietnam, whether they wanted to or not. The tragedy of the boat people was not just the immediate suffering of those who fled, but the long-term destruction of communities and culture that had taken centuries to develop. The Chinese Vietnamese, who had served as middlemen in the economy, the intellectuals and professionals who had provided leadership, the entrepreneurs who had created businesses, all of these groups were scattered to the winds, their contributions to Vietnamese society lost forever. In Vietnam itself, the departure of so many educated and skilled people created a brain drain that hampered economic development for decades. The government that had driven out the boat people later found itself struggling to attract foreign investment and technical expertise, slowly recognizing that the very people they had persecuted might have been assets rather than liabilities. The children who had been too young to remember Vietnam when their families fled grew up with stories and photographs, with fragments of a culture that their parents tried to preserve in foreign lands. They learned to navigate between the expectations of refugee parents who wanted them to succeed in their new countries and the pull of an ancestral homeland that existed more in imagination than in memory. The ocean that had carried so many refugees to freedom or death remained indifferent to human suffering, its waves washing clean the beaches where broken boats had come ashore, its depths keeping the secrets of those who had not survived the journey. But the survivors carried with them the memory of what they had lost and what they had endured, becoming living testimonies to the long aftermath of a war that had ended but whose consequences continue to ripple through time like waves spreading from a stone dropped in still water. 40 years have passed since the last helicopter lifted off from the rooftop of the American Embassy in Saigon, but the weight of Vietnam continues to press down on the American consciousness like humidity that never breaks into rain. The war that was supposed to have been forgotten, filed away in the archives of history like other unpleasant episodes, instead became a touchstone for every foreign policy debate, a question mark that followed America into every subsequent conflict. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., designed by Maya Lin when she was still a college student, became an unexpected place of pilgrimage where the abstract cost of war was made concrete in 58,000 names carved into black granite. The wall reflects the faces of visitors like a dark mirror, forcing them to see themselves alongside the names of the dead, to confront the human cost of policy decisions made in rooms where the smell of death never penetrated. Veterans who had returned from Vietnam to a country that preferred not to acknowledge their service found themselves decades later finally receiving the recognition that had been withheld during the immediate aftermath of the war. The parades and ceremonies that had been denied to returning soldiers in the 1970s were finally held in the 1980s and 1990s, but they carried with them the bittersweet knowledge that acknowledgement had come too late for many who had died of war-related illnesses or suicide, victims of a conflict that continued to claim lives long after the shooting stopped. The effects of Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant that had been sprayed over millions of acres of Vietnamese jungle, continued to poison both American veterans and Vietnamese civilians decades after the war ended. The children born with birth defects, the cancers that appeared years later, the neurological disorders that destroyed minds and bodies, all testified to the long reach of a war that had seemed to end with the fall of Saigon, but had actually continued in the cellular damage that passed from generation to generation. In Vietnam itself, the process of rebuilding began slowly, hampered by international isolation, economic sanctions, and the massive task of clearing unexploded ordnance from farmland and forests. The American embargo that was imposed after the communist victory lasted until the 1990s, ensuring that the Vietnamese people continued to pay the price for their government's policies long after the fighting ended. The gradual normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam was complicated by the emotional legacy of a war that had scarred both nations. The Vietnamese who had stayed in their homeland during the communist era found themselves living in a country that bore little resemblance to either the North or South Vietnam that had existed during the war. The socialist transformation that had been promised brought improvements in education and healthcare, but also economic stagnation and political repression. The free market reforms that began in the 1980s, known as Doi Moi, gradually opened the country to foreign investment and internal entrepreneurship, but the pace of change was controlled by a government that remained suspicious of outside influence. The reunification of North and South Vietnam, which had been the stated goal of the communist forces throughout the war, proved to be more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The differences between the two regions, economic, cultural, and political, had been deepened by decades of separate development and conflict. The southern provinces that had been integrated into the global economy during the American war years struggled to adapt to the centralized planning of the socialist system, while the North found it difficult to absorb the more cosmopolitan and individualistic culture of the South. The generation of Americans who had come of age during the Vietnam War carried its lessons into positions of leadership in government, business, and academia. The reluctance to commit American ground forces to foreign conflicts, known as the Vietnam Syndrome, influenced military interventions for decades, leading to strategies that emphasized air power over infantry, technology over manpower, quick strikes over long-term occupation. The Persian Gulf War of 1991 was planned and executed with deliberate attention to avoiding the mistakes of Vietnam, but subsequent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan revealed that the fundamental problems of nation-building and counterinsurgency had not been solved by technological advancement. The cultural impact of Vietnam extended far beyond military strategy and foreign policy. The war had coincided with and contributed to a broader transformation of American society that included the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, and the environmental movement. The questioning of authority that had begun with protests against the war expanded to include challenges to all forms of established power, from corporate capitalism to traditional gender roles to the destruction of the natural environment. The music, literature, and films that emerged from the Vietnam experience created a new vocabulary for discussing the psychological cost of war and the moral ambiguity of violence. The songs of Bob Dylan and Country Joe McDonald, the novels of Tim O'Brien and Philip Caputo, the films of Francis Ford Coppola and Oliver Stone all contributed to a cultural reckoning with the meaning of the war that was more honest and complex than the official narratives provided by government sources. The Vietnamese American community that had been created by the refugee exodus became a permanent part of American society, contributing to the country's economic and cultural diversity while maintaining strong connections to the homeland they had left behind. The second and third generations of Vietnamese Americans found themselves navigating between the traumatic memories of their parents and grandparents and their own identity as Americans who happened to have Vietnamese ancestry. The reconciliation between former enemies took many forms, from official diplomatic initiatives to private efforts by veterans and civilians to heal the wounds left by war. American veterans returned to Vietnam as tourists, searching for the battlefields where they had fought and the villages where they had served, trying to make sense of experiences that had shaped their entire lives. Some found peace in these journeys, while others discovered that the Vietnam they remembered existed only in their own memories. Vietnamese refugees who had sworn never to return to their homeland as long as it remained under communist rule gradually began to visit families they had not seen for decades, carrying gifts and money that helped bridge the economic gap between the overseas Vietnamese and those who had remained behind. These visits revealed how much both groups had changed during the years of separation, how different their experiences had been, how difficult it was to reconnect across the chasm created by war and ideology. The children who had been born during the war, both American and Vietnamese, grew up to become the inheritors of its legacy, responsible for making sense of their parents' trauma and their own identity in a world that had moved on to new conflicts and new challenges. They founded organizations dedicated to veterans affairs and refugee assistance, to environmental cleanup and historical preservation, to ensuring that the lessons of Vietnam would not be forgotten by future generations. The historians and political scientists who studied the war produced thousands of books and articles trying to understand how and why it had happened, what mistakes had been made, what lessons could be learned. The interpretations varied widely, from those who blamed American policymakers for not understanding Vietnamese culture, to those who blamed anti-war protesters for undermining military morale, from those who saw the war as an inevitable result of Cold War logic, to those who viewed it as a tragic misapplication of American idealism. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Vietnam War was the recognition that good intentions were not enough to justify the use of military force, that democratic societies had both the right and the responsibility to question their government's decisions about war and peace. The war had demonstrated the limits of American power and the dangers of hubris, But it had also shown the strength of democratic institutions and the importance of a free press in holding leaders accountable for their actions. As the veterans of Vietnam entered their final years, they carried with them memories that no one else could fully understand. The weight of friends lost, the burden of decisions made under impossible circumstances, the knowledge of what human beings were capable of doing to each other when ideology and nationalism overrode common humanity. They had learned that war was not glorious but necessary sometimes, not heroic but human always, not simple but complex beyond the ability of any doctrine or strategy to capture. The night sounds of Vietnam, the helicopter rotors and artillery fire, the call of exotic birds and the whisper of wind through bamboo, continued to echo in their dreams, mixed now with the sounds of grandchildren playing and morning coffee brewing, the ordinary miracles of a life lived beyond war. They had come home to a country that was both the same and completely different, that had honored them belatedly and imperfectly, that had learned from their sacrifice even if it had not always acknowledged it. In the end, the Vietnam War became what all wars become, a human story of courage and cowardice, of love and loss, of young people asked to do impossible things in impossible circumstances. The grand strategies and political theories that had seemed so important at the time faded into footnotes, while the individual stories of sacrifice and survival, of brotherhood and betrayal, of ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges, remained to remind future generations of the true cost of war and the true price of peace. The darkness that had fallen over Southeast Asia in the 1960s and 1970s had finally lifted, but the lessons it had taught about the limits of power and the importance of truth, about the cost of good intentions and the value of hard-won wisdom, continued to illuminate the path forward. For a nation that had learned at great cost that not all problems could be solved by force, that not all good causes were worth any price, that the greatest strength of a democracy lay not in its weapons, but in its willingness to question itself and learn from its mistakes. The war was over, but its echoes would resonate through time like the sound of distant thunder, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been learned, of the price of hubris and the possibility of redemption, of the darkness that could fall when good people made bad choices, and the light that could emerge when nations and individuals had the courage to face their own failures and find a way forward. Listen. Can you hear it? The gentle lapping of water against wooden boats in a distant delta, the whisper of wind through palm fronds, the echo of children's laughter across courtyards where incense burns before ancestral altars. These are the sounds that remain when the thunder of war fades. When the last helicopter disappears over the horizon, when the veterans come home and the refugees find new shores. The Mekong still flows toward the sea, carrying with it the red clay of Vietnam, and the dreams of generations who have lived along its banks. The rice still grows in paddies that were once battlefields, tended by farmers who remember when their fields were landing zones, but who have returned to the ancient rhythms of planting and harvest, of watching the sky for monsoon clouds rather than aircraft. The war that seemed like it would last forever ended, as all wars must, with silence falling over landscapes that had known too much noise, with morning mist rising from rivers that had reflected too many funeral pyres, with children playing in villages that had been born from the ashes of destruction. The human capacity for renewal proved stronger than the human genius for devastation, though the scars remain like fault lines in the earth, reminders of what happened when the world forgot how to listen to itself. In America, the memorials stand like questions carved in stone, asking what we learned from sending our children to die in a land we never understood, for a cause we could never clearly define. The names on the black granite wall reflect our faces back at us, forcing us to see ourselves in the company of the dead, to ask what their sacrifice meant and whether we are worthy of it. In Vietnam, the country that was torn apart and put back together, the temples still echo with the chants of monks who prayed through bombardments and survived to see peace return to their ancient land. The children of former enemies play together in schoolyards built over bunkers, learning the lessons their parents had to write in blood and tears. The refugees scattered across the globe carry with them pieces of a homeland that exists now more in memory than on any map. But they have planted new gardens in foreign soil, raised children who speak with American accents and Vietnamese hearts, built bridges between worlds that once seemed permanently divided by ideology and war. And in the quiet moments, when the arguments about strategy and politics fade into the distance like echoes of old thunder, what remains is the knowledge that ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances found reserves of courage and compassion they never knew they possessed. They learned that love was stronger than hate, that hope was more powerful than fear, that the human spirit could endure anything and still find reason to sing. Close your eyes now and let the weight of these stories settle into your consciousness like sediment in a quiet river. Feel the presence of all those who lived through this time, the soldiers who carried more than rifles, the civilians who endured more than any people should have to endure, the families who waited and worried and grieved and celebrated and learned that life continues even when it seems impossible. The darkness of war gives way to the dawn of understanding. The chaos of conflict yields to the order of memory, and the cacophony of battle fades into the whisper of wind through memorial gardens, where flowers grow in soil that was once stained with blood, but now nurtures new life, new hope, new possibilities for peace. Sleep now, and dream of a world where the lessons of Vietnam are not forgotten, but transformed into wisdom, where the sacrifices of the past become the foundation for a more peaceful future, where the children of former enemies grow up to be friends, and where the long night of war finally gives way to the eternal morning of human understanding. The river remembers everything and forgives all, carrying the past toward a future where love proves stronger than hate, where truth outlasts deception, and where the human capacity for redemption offers hope even in the darkest hours of history. Sleep well and dream of peace.